Perception by James Carlson, Lisa Liberty, and Nicole Marshall. Selective attention. At any moment, our awareness focuses on only a limited aspect of all that we experience. If you stare at the cube, you may notice that it reverses location, moving the tiny X in the center from the front edge of the book. At times, it may seem like the cube will float in front of the page with circles behind it. Because of attention that is selective, you may only see one interpretation at a time. Perceptual illusions. Do you see a glowing blue worm curving through the black lines added? Anything else you perceive is a product of your creative genius. The ripple in the flat, two-dimensional figure, your first thought isn't to perceive this as that. Your brain sees the ripple that is actually not there, showing it to be a three-dimensional figure rather than just a two-dimensional figure. Form perception is the relationship continually that reverses but always that we organize the stimulus into a figure seen almost on the ground. This figure can demonstrate the same stimulus that can trigger more than just one perception. Proximity, we can group nearby figures together. We can see not only 6 separate lines, but 3 sets of 2 figures. Similarity, we group together figures that are similar to one another. We see the triangles and circles in vertical columns of similar shapes, but not as horizontal rows of dissimilar shapes. Continuity, we perceive smooth, continuous patterns rather than discontinuous ones. This pattern could be a series of alternating semicircles, but we perceive it to be as 2 continuous lines, one wavy and one straight. Connectedness, because they are uniformed and linked, we perceive the 2 dots and the line between them as a single unit. Closure. We fill in the gaps to create a complete whole object in this figure. Thus we assume that the circles above are complete by partially blocked by the illusionary triangle. Add nothing more than little line segments that close off the circles, and now your brain stops constructing a triangle. Visual cliff. Eleanor Gibson and Richard Walk devised this miniature cliff in this figure above with a glass-covered drop-off to determine whether crawling infants and newborn animals can perceive the depth perception. Even when coaxed, infants are reluctant to venture onto the glass over the cliff. The floating figure sausage picture above represents retinal disparity. If you hold your 2 fingers about 5 inches apart in front of your eyes with the tips half an inch apart, now look beyond them and note the weird result. Move your fingers out farther and the retinal disparity with the finger sausage will shrink. In the picture above, thanks to relative height, lower objects may seem closer and thus are perceived as a figure, showing that the figure of the objects are closer than perceived.
The linear perspective is when parallel lines appear to converge. The more the lines converge, the greater their perceived distance. These railroad tracks are a great example of linear perspective. Light and shadow. Nearby objects reflect more light to our eyes than objects further away. Given 2 identical objects, the dimmer one seems farther away. Monocular cues. Monocular cues convey depth on a flat canvas. In the image with the hunter, it appears that the elephant is far away, instead of about to be speared. Perceptual constancy. Perceptual constancy allows us to perceive an object as unchanging despite a changing stimulus. This is a top-down process. That means we can identify things regardless of the distance, angle, and illumination by which we see them. Look at the image of the tables. Do the tabletops appear to have different dimensions? It may appear that way, but they are actually identical. Size-distance relationship. Given an object, we infer its size as a result of our perceived distance and the size of its image on our retinas. In the image with the monsters, both monsters cast the same retinal images. But the linear perspective tells the brain that the monster being pursued is farther away. We therefore perceive it as larger. Lightness constancy. Perceived lightness depends on relative luminance, the amount of light an object reflects relative to its surroundings. If you view sunlight black paper through a narrow tube so nothing else is visible, it may look gray, because in bright sunshine it reflects a fair amount of light. In the image below, the visual system computes brightness and color relative to surrounding objects, thus perceived lightness changes with context.
Next, we have the idea of context effects, which is the idea that immediate context can trigger many different perceptions. For example, when somebody says to you, eel on a wagon, you might interpret it and hear it as wheel on a wagon, because wheel is what fits in context with wagon. Also, if you look at the pictures of the rabbits and the box, depending on the context given by the rabbits, the box can appear to be either lying on the floor, hanging from the ceiling, or just being viewed from a different angle. This is all because of our contextual backgrounds and what we use to interpret different things. This is also relevant in our culture. If you look at this picture, depending on the cultural perspective that you might have, if you're from a more developed environment, you might perceive this image as a family sitting inside with a woman sitting under a window. But if you live in a more third world country, you might perceive this as a family sitting underneath a tree outdoors with a woman balancing her box on her head. This is because all of our different cultures give us different ideas about how things are, and therefore allow us to view things differently. The effects of perceptual sets and context help us to construct perception. A perceptual set is a mental predisposition that functions as a lens through which we perceive the world. Next, we have the idea of human factor psychology. Human factor psychology explores how people and machines interact and how machines and physical environments can be made safe and easy to use. VCRs, TiVos, and stoves all need to be designed with humans in mind so that they can be used without too much difficulty. The idea of natural mapping is designing an object so that they do not require any information from memory to be performed. If you look at the stove, the one on the left has knobs on the side, which would need instructions from a manual to be remembered to use. However, the one on the right has knobs that correspond directly to each burner on the stove. Therefore, no memory needs to be used. You can just look at the stove and know how to use it. The point to remember is that designers and engineers need to consider the human factor by designing things to fit people and being mindful of the curse of knowledge, or making products easy to learn, and testing their creations before they go into production. Next, we have the idea of ESP, or extrasensory perception. It is the controversial claim that perception can occur apart from sensory input, and this concludes telepathy, clairvoyance and precognition, and psychokinesis. Psychokinesis is the idea of mind over matter, such as levitating a table or influencing the roll of a die. Extrasensory perception, telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition is the other category. Telepathy is mind-to-mind communication. Clairvoyance is the idea that you can perceive remote events like my house is on fire, or precognition is being able to perceive future events. My house is going to catch on fire. Most people agree that ESP does not actually exist. People have argued that no psychic, quote unquote, has ever been able to predict a lottery jackpot or make millions in the stock market, nor has anybody predicted 9/11 or Hurricane Katrina, which have been quite helpful. Research has shown that psychic visions are no more accurate than anybody else's guess. And when survey of police departments were done, only 35% of police departments in the U.S.'s 50 largest cities have said they use psychics to help most investigations, and that none of them found it helpful. It's argued that most vague predictions that psychics make are retrofitted to match events that provide perceptual sets for interpreting them. Therefore, anything that is said can kind of be stretched into whatever the person who listens to it wants it to be. People still believe in ESP because of their desire for the paranormal and the unknown. And so people really like to get involved in this and believe it as true, even if they know maybe deep down that it's not, because it doesn't make any logical sense. And that is about the end of our chapter. Thank you for reviewing the perception with us.